But regardless, elite sports is all about people who are way outside the norm in a lot of different ways. And a lot of it comes down to genetic advantage, right? Caitlin Clark is 6 feet tall. That's outside the norm for women. It gives her an advantage over other women who play basketball. But people don't say, oh, that's unfair. Women basketball players can only be the average height of women or lower. And she also didn't do anything to earn that, right? It was that in combination with, of course, a lot of hard work and skill because being tall is not enough. But a point I've made in thinking about these issues is that gender policing and the obsession with gender in sports hurts all women, including cis women. So maybe this goes to your point, John, and cis people need to think about how it affects them.
Hello, and thank you for joining us. Welcome to a new episode of Power and Flower. I am Seth Maskett.
And I'm John Hagner.
We are a political scientist and a political consultant who are trying to understand and explain what's going on in U.S. politics, and we also care deeply about pastries. So, a few weeks ago, on this very podcast, we were talking about public opinion, things like how closely Democrats should or could be following it, the extent to which it can be influenced or manufactured, and more. In particular, we noted that support for transgender Americans is reasonably strong, but it's weak in areas like trans athletes, particularly trans women playing on women's teams, which is why the Trump campaign and other Republicans singled that out as an issue last year. That is, they were focusing on the least popular aspect of a somewhat unpopular minority group. Many Democrats were squirming about defending them. More generally, Republicans were focusing on an issue that directly affects, like, really fewer than a dozen Americans, but elevating it to a central campaign issue and a full-blown moral panic. My colleague, Professor Sarah Chatfield, had some thoughts on this and has written on this and other related issues, so we figured we'd invite her onto the show. Sarah has a particularly novel and useful take here. Sarah is the author of the recent book, The Politics of Bathroom Access and Exclusion in the United States, published late last year by Cambridge University Press. It is not something we often think about, but state governments have had a massive increase in laws regulating access to public bathrooms in the past few decades. Bathroom access is actually a longstanding area of lawmaking in the United States. The book argues that this is the way governments have decided who is a full citizen of the United States and who isn't. We are very excited to have Sarah on to discuss this. So, as a brief introduction, Sarah Chatfield is an associate professor of political science at the University of Denver. Her research focuses on American political development, women in politics, and political behavior, and she is also the author of the book in her own name, The Politics of Women's Rights Before Suffrage. Sarah, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. Very glad to be here, Seth and John. Thank you for having me on the podcast. Longtime listener. Glad to be on.
Excellent.
And thank you so much for being on and for listening. It's a great example. So I was hoping just to start off, can you tell us a bit about your book, The Politics of Bathroom Access? What motivated you to write this? What are your main arguments?
Yeah, so this actually didn't start out as a research project. This started out as a course that I taught as part of our first year seminar program at University of Denver on bathrooms and politics. And I chose this topic for our first year seminar program in particular because it's a program that aims to kind of identify topics that can bring in students no matter what their experiences or backgrounds. And I figured everyone uses a bathroom at some point in time. So, and it's turned out to be a really fun course to teach. We go through not just issues relating to trans folks' access to bathrooms, but we talk about the history of this. So racial segregation in bathrooms, the first sex segregated bathrooms in the 1800s. We talk about homeless folks in Denver and their ability to access or not access bathrooms and how that affects their quality of life. We talk about menstrual equity policies. So, for example, K through 12 schools providing free menstrual products in bathrooms, which is something that we got one of our state legislators who wrote the bill on that to come in and talk to students about her work on that. So it's been a really fun class. And then as I was casting about for a second book project, this idea was like, well, I've already done a lot of the research in putting this class together. And I'd like to see more scholarship about it out there in the world. And so that's kind of how the book came together.
Wow. Cool. Okay. So thank you for that rundown. So like I was wondering if you could, I mean, you mentioned briefly racial segregation, sex segregation, homelessness. Um, can you give us an example of like how is bathroom access tied to citizenship, as you argue? Like what is it that makes someone a full or not full citizen?
Yeah. So the theory that I kind of base this on in the book comes from a political theorist, T.H. Marshall, who thinks about different aspects of citizenship, right? There's your legal passport. So I'm a US citizen by nature, in my case, of having been born here. But he says, well, that's not all there is to citizenship, right? And social citizenship, as he defines it, is thinking about being a full member of society, having access to opportunities, to dignity, to inclusion. And so, for example, if a person has a passport but doesn't have access to those things, we might say they have legal citizenship but not social citizenship. And so, in this context, I really think about bathrooms as creating both physical and symbolic limits on citizenship, right? So, in a physical sense, you can't be out in public or at your job or at school for longer than you can hold it, right? If you're Cory Booker, that may be over 24 hours.
Right.
But for the average person, it is not that long. um, and you really have that physical time limit on how long you can be out unless you are willing to risk public urination, which has a lot of gendered components. In many places, it is illegal and could even require you to register as a sex offender if you're targeted for that. So it really is this physical limitation on how long you can be out of your home or some other place where you have access to a bathroom if you're not able to safely access one outside the home. And then, in a more psychological or symbolic sense, the laws and rules that we have around bathrooms send these powerful messages to people about their dignity, about their belongingness to society. When we have signs on the doors, either literal in the case of racial segregation, or figuratively now, I would say, in the case of trans folks in some states. Also, one of the topics I talk about in the book is disability accessibility. There may not be a sign that says no disability accessibility, but often that's the reality for folks depending on their particular disability. Those send powerful messages of, do you belong in our society? Are you a full member or not?
Wow. So thank you for this. My impression on this is that a lot of the rules about bathroom access, whether it's about race, whether it's about sex, sexual preference, or anything else, it based on a lot of fear, or it taps into a lot of fears. And I'm just curious, are there ways to overcome people's fears about this, or does this basically only sort of move in one direction? Is this just an inherently divisive and panicky issue for most people?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I'm not a psychologist, and I'd love to have John jump in because I think you've actually done some of the research on this that my research is more policy based, but I would say just based on the repeated use of bathrooms to delineate the boundaries of social citizenship and belongingness in our country's history, there probably is something about them that can really push people's buttons. But that being said, I also think it's not the case that it's only in one direction, right? We have states passing anti-trans bathroom bills. We also have states passing inclusive laws that are intentionally about protecting people's rights in that space. There's also a lot of really interesting legislation that I talk about in the book that's about increasing access for disabled folks, for parents, for example, requiring baby changing tables to not only be in women's rooms, but also be in men's rooms in recognition of fathers as caregivers who would be wanting to change their baby's diaper. So I don't think it's only one direction. I will say when I talk about this in my class with students who come to the class with a whole variety of different perspectives, one of the things we talk about is perspective taking and thinking about, for some people in the class, bathroom access is something that basically never crosses their mind as more than a passing thought.
Mhm.
It you realize you have to pee and you go find a bathroom that you can use and you use it. Whereas for other people, it really takes up a huge amount of mental space, planning and thinking about, can I go to this place at all? If I do, where are the bathrooms going to be? What is my plan going to be? Am I going to have to intentionally dehydrate myself or not eat in order to make it through the school day? There's a lot of stories, unfortunately, of trans kids who do that in order to avoid having to use the bathroom at school. And so being able to talk with students about thinking, for me, this might not be something that really ever is a problem in my life, or maybe occasionally on a road trip comes up. But
Right.
for others, it's a daily mental toll to be thinking about access to a bathroom. I think is helpful. But John, I'd also love to hear some of the research
Yeah.
you've done on this.
Yeah. Thank you for that opening. And I think that, bathrooms are, people are vulnerable in them. And it is one of the only, it's the only public space that, folks feel exposed both literally and physically. And it's a place, I think it's not surprising psychologically that we get much more worked up about bathrooms than kitchens, or that we get much more worked up about bathrooms than, theater seats. Because there is, um, there's a nakedness, literally and metaphorically. I think a lot of the bathroom conflation also is even more pronounced with locker rooms, which I think are connected in a meaningful way here. As I went to the YMCA in downtown DC for a long time when I lived here, and there were two men's rooms and two women's rooms, because the building was so old that it was built in the segregation era. And it's a real reminder that, like, oh yeah, this goes way back. But I think thinking about a lot of the research that I've done over the last couple decades has been specifically around transgender people's access to public spaces and bathrooms. And it's, as you mentioned, a topic that has changed a lot, and that people's opinions have really evolved, both for the good. And when I say the good, I think people should have access to bathrooms. I'm not shy about that. So both in favor of more access, but there's also been a backlash there. One of the things that we've found that's really interesting is that when we talk about this issue, the first conversation is often the voter is confused, or the respondent, because, as you say, a lot of cis people never think about this. They don't think that it matters. And so when you say, like, do you think that people should be able to use the bathroom? Their instinct is to be like, sure, everyone should use the bathroom. And then the second part of that conversation is where there starts to be, well, actually, do I feel safe if this person is with me? Or does my daughter feel safe? People are often sort of translating this to children in particular. And then the third part of the conversation is like, oh yeah, people just need to pee, right? They go in the room, they close the door, it's fine, right? Because you think about it, yeah, it doesn't actually matter who the person in the next stall is, but you have to think about that, and there's a process, right? And it's a process of, again, most people's instinct. Most people believe in non-discrimination as a value. They believe that folks should have access to things. So the instinct is yes. Then there's a backlash, and then people can be moved through that. As we've been thinking, and we did a lot of research with I worked with the Equality Federation, and the Gill Foundation funded a lot of this work, which is a big Colorado um, philanthropic group. We wanted to see how can we basically simulate that conversation with voters in a mass media way, right? So if there's a ballot initiative, or if this becomes political, instead of needing to sit down with every person and say, yeah, people should really use the bathroom. You're right. Oh, but is that safe? Yes, it's safe. How can we get them there? Um, and one of the things that we found in this research, which was not what we had hoped to find, we had thought that the best way to do this would be to have trans people tell their own stories, right? Like, I just want to pee. I'm trans. I shouldn't have to be excluded, or I shouldn't have to use a place that makes me feel unsafe. What we found is actually the opposite, that the best messengers for that are cisgendered people, because cisgendered people love to be the hero. We love to be the hero of every story. Speaking as a white cisgendered man, we really love to be the hero of their story. But what we found is that the best way to move, again, other cis people through this is to say, I don't care who uses the bathroom. I am safe. I know that I am safe. I don't need to worry, because that is where folks can sympathize with, right? That cis people don't think about, am I going to be excluded from the bathroom? Because as you say, they're not worried about it. So you don't approach it from a, this is personal to you. You need to approach it from a, this doesn't matter. You're going to be fine. I think a lot of the sort of more clever messaging is, you have used the bathroom with trans people hundreds of times in your life and it didn't matter. You just didn't know about it, because why would you need to know about it, right? Like, what's happening in the stall next to you doesn't matter. I do think that locker rooms are a little bit more complicated. And I think, talking to trans friends and allies and collaborators, it's, you know, the kind of public nudity of a locker room is different than a bathroom. And I think a lot of the trans folks that I talk to, are themselves, because of safety concerns, much less interested in access to those spaces. But I also think that it's not, again, to your point about, you can be a citizen fully without needing to go to a locker room in the way that you can't in a bathroom.
Yeah, and I think when this issue has come up with my students, one of the things everyone has said is we'd all like to have, for example, taller door stalls in bathrooms, and we'd all like more privacy in locker rooms, because most people, whether they are cis or trans, do not actually like getting naked in front of a bunch of strangers. So some of this is an interesting design question of like, maybe more privacy could benefit everybody.
Yeah. Well, and a lot of those shorter barriers in bathrooms, to get to another part of the LGBT spectrum, right? Like, I'll only speak to men's rooms. A lot of them have gotten shorter because people were worried about public sex, right?
Yeah.
And cottaging and all the
Mhm.
rest of that. Which I guess is, I think, a place for LGBT rights is a big, complicated spectrum where folks' interests are not always aligned.
Definitely.
So, Sarah, I mean, I guess just to sort of move in this direction, I know you're not a campaign strategist or anything like this, but obviously you've had a lot of discussions on this topic with students and others. And so obviously Republicans have decided, to make a campaign issue about the acceptance of transgender people. And I'm curious if you've seen ways or heard arguments that you think Democrats could be pushing back on this. So, like, for example, when Donald Trump comes with the campaign slogan, "She's for they, them, Trump is for you." Are there arguments Kamala Harris should be making in response to that? Should she simply not touch it? Was that ad even effective in the first place? I'm curious your thoughts on this.
Um, well, yeah, that's interesting. And again, I'm not a campaign strategist.
Right.
As far as the pronoun question, I guess I would say we always call people what they want us to call them. Ted Cruz is not actually Ted Cruz, but nobody has a problem with that. Um, right? John, I assume you were not born with John on your birth certificate.
I am
Oh, you
actually.
are? Okay.
Most people with H's are just Johns. We're
Okay.
not Jonathans.
Mm.
Well, many Jonathans out there go by John.
I
um,
dated a Jonathan once, and I made him go by Jonathan, even though he usually went by John. I was like, that's too
that
confusing.
is
We're not
fair.
No,
doing
That is
that.
fair.
that's very helpful
Um,
that way. Yeah.
but yeah, nicknames, calling people by their middle name, calling people by whatever they tell us their name is just a normal part of polite society. And so it's pretty bizarre to me that it's gotten so politicized. So when it comes to this question of athletics, I'll just share a few thoughts I've had on this topic. I think one of them is that a lot of the sports people do are not actually competitive in a meaningful sense. And I think that's important to talk about with voters. My daughter is 7. Her soccer league doesn't even keep score in the games because they don't want the kids to get wrapped up in that. If there was a trans girl on her team, first of all, we probably wouldn't know, but also there would be no competitive issue with that. There was also just a news story about a trans woman in New York City who was kicked out of her amateur tennis league that costs $40 to join, and the players, the only way that they're paired up in the games is based on their self-described skill level. So, hey, I define myself as beginner or intermediate. It feels ridiculous to me to exclude trans folks from the many sports opportunities we have in life that are just simply not competitive and the stakes are not high. And then when we're talking about competitive women's sports, I think a lot of sports, it's sports specific, and there's generally been pretty reasonable compromises to not just allow someone to walk up one day and say, I'm competing in the women's division, but to have a period of being on hormone therapy which at least reduces competitive advantage from testosterone. Does it eliminate all advantages? I think the science isn't clear on that, and it's very dependent on sport, right?
Hmm.
Being taller as a result of having had a puberty that was dependent on testosterone is going to be an advantage in basketball, probably a big disadvantage in my personal favorite women's sport, gymnastics. Um, but regardless, elite sports is all about people who are way outside the norm in a lot of different ways. And a lot of it comes down to genetic advantage, right? Caitlin Clark is 6 feet tall. That's outside the norm for women. It gives her an advantage over other women who play basketball. But people don't say, oh, that's unfair. Women basketball players can only be the average height of women or lower. Um,
Right.
and she also didn't do anything to earn that, right? It was that in combination with, of course, a lot of hard work and skill because being tall is not enough. But I think a point I've made in thinking about these issues is that gender policing and the obsession with gender in sports hurts all women, including cis women. So maybe this goes to your point, John, and cis people need to think about how it affects them. If you search online, there's actually tons of social media posts from people saying, maybe Caitlin Clark is trans. Maybe she's
Hmm.
secretly trans.
Mm.
Obviously, she's not. The most prominent example of this is probably from the last Olympics. Aman Khalif of Algeria. She is a gold medal winning boxer whose success in the past Olympics was overshadowed by this huge social media campaign questioning her gender identity. She is very clearly not transgender, but she was singled out for being too good at her sport for a woman, for not appearing feminine enough. Probably this was also influenced by her race. Black athletes have historically been more likely to face these false accusations of being secretly transgender or secretly men. And when we have this culture that obsesses over the gender identity of athletes over and above their athletic skill, I think it hurts all women athletes, both trans and cis. And I think some way of trying to communicate to voters that this is just a really unhealthy culture around women's sports that hurts all the athletes, I would hope might make some type of difference. But again, I haven't tested it with focus groups, but I guess it's my view on why this obsession over a very small number of athletes, who ultimately, when we're talking about the elite level, generally there are rules around how soon after transitioning they can actually compete, um, really is toxic to women's sports generally.
No, for sure. And I think so much of it is bad faith, right? That
Yeah.
the people who are there talking about trans women and women's sports are not going to WNBA games. Like it's not, this is not a, the people who are the champions of women's sports are almost always the most inclusive. I also think it was really, to your example in the Olympics, the idea that, Algeria of all places is going to be a hotbed of trans inclusion,
No.
strikes me as unlikely. But the world, I guess, is a complicated place. Yeah, I think I agree with everything that you said, and I think I want to frame my next comments in like I wish that what you said was the way that everybody thought about this
Yeah.
because it is the way everybody should think about this. And nothing that I'm about to say, I want people to think, oh, that's what John Hagner believes, because I absolutely agree with you. I think the struggle politically that we're having is that uh, right now, the only argument that we can make to people who are concerned about trans women in women's sports is that they shouldn't care about it, right? And that's politically a really hard thing to do. To tell someone to not care about a thing that they are telling you that they care about is just a really hard conversation because it seems very elitist, it seems very dismissive, it seems very condescending. That saying, "Oh no, no, we know better than you. This is not a problem that you need to worry about," is it's just a very hard place to start. And I think that, there needs to be some ways to give people more comfort with what the rules are. And I think that you're right that there are rules in place. Most people don't know that. And it's I think one of the solutions might be talking more about the like, yeah, maybe boxing is a place that if you experienced biological male puberty, boxing may not be an appropriate sport just because it is, so physical. But gymnastics, to your point, might be. I think that like I think everybody needs to kind of back away from the extremes on this. And I think that, obviously the people who are anti-trans are not really doing this because they care about women's sports. They're doing it because they want to exclude trans people from public life. They need to back away. Obviously, they don't listen to me. But I think and what you're saying, like Congresswoman Sarah McBride, a lot of other trans leaders, I think are taking the point now of like, we need to talk about this. We need to figure out the right way of doing it. Everybody needs to step back from the edge of like, because no one is actually saying that someone who is never identified as a woman can walk in to the Olympics and say, I'm 6'4", I'm a linebacker, I'm here to join the field hockey team, right? Like that is not a position that anyone is taking, but it's rhetorically what I think our opponents think that might be true. And I think we all just have to, again, take a step back and say, like, we need to be flexible. We need to find ways of being flexible because again, we can't start this conversation with you shouldn't worry about this. This is not a thing you care about because again, voters do. And sports, as much as we've been talking about is bathrooms is a way of being a citizen. Sports are really important to Americans' view of themselves, view of their communities. We have for some reason decided to link up semi-pro sports and academics, and like the way you get to go to college without going into debt forever is by winning, being the fastest swimmer, which objectively doesn't make any sense, but we did it anyway. And so folks do think about the ways in which their access to education and opportunities might be limited. I think the woman who has become famous for being opposed to women in sports tied for fifth, which I do think is a funny part of this. Like she lost to a trans woman and she lost to four cis women, but that's not what she talks about. But she thinks about it as something that was taken from her. And I think other voters hear that and say, oh, something might be taken from me or be taken from girls that I care about. Because again, this is only an issue that we talk about in the context of trans women in sports. There are a lot of trans male athletes that, we don't have the same panic on. So I've meandered a little bit with here, but I think it is a tough issue. I wish it weren't a tough issue. It shouldn't be. But I think until what we saw with LGB rights, before we get into trans issues, is that there was a slow movement over a long time, and then we hit an inflection point when a lot of people who had become comfortable with LGB issues became the majority of the population, and frankly, people who were less comfortable naturally left the electorate, as we might say, by dying. And I think that trans issues are 20 or 30 years behind that. And I think what we're seeing is as people are meeting more trans folks, as more trans folks are more prominent in public life, as folks like Sarah McBride and Laverne Cox and other people are giving folks a comfort level people who may not know out trans people in their day-to-day life in the way that they know out gay people, are getting more comfortable. I think we're seeing that trend, but it is behind. And there's definitely a lot of work to be done there.
So I'm definitely not positioning myself between you two here, but there was there was an interview earlier this week. Senator Tommy Tuberville said, and I'm quoting him directly here, "We have entire men's teams across the country now that are turning trans, women's teams, they're turning trans." Obviously, this isn't remotely true. And I don't think there are that many people who take him seriously. He was fact checked, but I think to Sarah's point, I don't know that there's anyone quite as outspoken on the other side of this who's saying, who's coming in defense of the trans community or athletes or anything like that. I don't say other people should be pushing vast lies on the left as well. But it would be great if there were just something other than the occasional, Yahoo News fact check or something like that.
Yeah, no, and it's one of the things Republicans are doing so well right now in general is that they are just throwing up it's so scattershot in the kinds of things they're saying on tariffs, on trans people, on the environment, on public employees. Like it's impossible to even know where to fight back right now because there's so much nonsense coming.
Yeah. And I think there does, if you only have one side saying the crazy things that are perhaps clearly untrue, but then people are getting this image of, oh, wow, maybe 15 men from the football team will suddenly just decide to become Olympic swimmers. of course, that's not reality, but if we're not challenging it publicly, I think the moral panic is sort of able to run away with it. And there needs to be some pushback on being a trans woman does not make you a superhero who can automatically beat every cis woman. It's simply not the reality that we've seen. And also demonizing this group is taking a lot away from, for example, kids or adults in non-competitive sports who just want to play and have fun and get all those things that we say sports is good for, like physical health and leadership skills and team building. And I think I would love to see pushback, real pushback on the left to say, hey, this issue is a lot more complicated and there are rules at the most elite level, and that's appropriate. And everywhere else, let's take a deep breath and let kids be kids and let amateur tennis players be amateur tennis players, and let people just enjoy sports for what it is, which largely is not about gold medals.
Right. No, I absolutely agree, and I think that everyone that the temperature just needs to be taken down, and I think the crucial work of people out there in their community saying, yeah, I have a trans friend and I want her to be on this team, and I think that to what we're talking about with bathrooms, the way through this is with more people getting more comfort. One of my favorite polling stats is that Americans think something like 17% of the population is transgender, when in fact it is about 1%. And Americans think that about 33% of the population are LGBT, when in fact it's about 4%. People have a wildly overstated view of people who they don't know and understand, right? And they watch Fox News or they watch other media, and they're getting this idea, that the Tommy Tuberville's of the world are saying that like every single NCAA athlete is a linebacker in a dress, and it's wrong, but the way that we combat that is with more exposure and more comfort. And the reason that gay rights and gay marriage happen so fast is because 30 years of people coming out to their families and coming out to their friends and telling their story increase the level of comfort. And I think one of the challenges around trans rights is that there just are so few trans people, that most people don't know a trans person or don't love a trans person that they know to be trans. But that's changing, and it's changing as more folks are more comfortable being themselves, and that process of coming out, but that has to work its way through the population. And I think we're going to need folks to get comfortable. We're going to need to understand what the limits are, what the rules are. Again, to your point, there are regulations in place. No one is saying that a 6'8" man with a beard, or a person with a beard who identifies in a way, should go, win the gold medal in boxing. But I think everybody has to be more comfortable just saying, let's figure out the rules. Let's do this case by case.
This has been a really interesting conversation. And I want to thank you both for this. And since we started talking about bathrooms, we should talk about food. There's never a good transition here, but
no, there's not. That was a particularly inelegant one.
Yeah. But I did want to, devote a few minutes to our second topic, which is always baking. And Sarah, I know you have been working with a cookbook recently. Could you tell us what you have for us today?
This is my current favorite cookbook. It's called Snacking Bakes. There's also a earlier version called Snacking Cakes. But the conceit behind this cookbook is that everything can be made with one bowl and one spoon, which for the parent of an elementary school student is like the perfect kid baking with your kid, as well as the perfect short on time baking strategy. And what I have particularly liked about Snacking Bakes is there are a couple of egg-free blondie recipes, which have been excellent as the cost of eggs has risen. And Seth and I also have a coworker who is very allergic to eggs. So it's been nice to bake those for her. And yeah, I highly recommend either of these cookbooks for anyone who is a little bit short on time, but still wants tasty baked goods in their life.
Awesome. Thank you. Okay, we will post a link to that book. That is a great suggestion. And I definitely could have used that when baking with my kids when they were young, because more than one bowl thing, it complicates things
It really
immeasurably. Um, John, tell us about your pastry tasting recently.
Yeah, so I'm getting married in 2 months, which is really exciting and really expensive, but mostly exciting. But I have been told by my wonderful fiance that I'm not allowed to make the cake for our wedding or any of the pastries, which I did want to do. But as he pointed out, I need to talk to people and enjoy myself. So we have we hired her just before she was named one of the James Beard Award semifinalists. She's now been named a finalist. Her name is Diane Mua, and she is the best pastry chef in Minnesota by far. And I'm so excited that we got the chance to go and taste. But we did a pastry tasting, and I'm telling anybody who's listening to this, if you are not engaged yet, go get engaged, because when you get engaged, you can go to Incredible Bakers and have them make you a cake flight, and then they don't charge you for it. It's the best. If I had known this, I would have gotten engaged so many times before now,
Wow.
and just eaten the cakes. But we are zooming in on a coconut and pandan filled profiterole and a carrot cake with Thai tea icing. Diane Mua is a Hmong American pastry chef. There's a really wonderful Hmong community in Minnesota, and she brings sort of classical French techniques with a lot of Southeast Asian flavors. And yeah, it's going to be incredible.
Oh, that's fantastic. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. I just wanted to, since it is we're just about Passover, I did want to put in a little plug for a thing I bake every year, Passover matzah farfel nut thins. It's basically a Passover cookie. It is made with matzah, no leavening, so it's legit kosher for Passover. It's a recipe that comes from Judy Zeidler, who is a wonderful Jewish cook who passed away a few years ago, actually a family friend. I'll post her recipe on here. I would say some people try to bake these on foil. It never works. These things are very fragile. Silpat or baking sheet are really necessary here. But they're one of the few things you can make for Passover that actually taste good, and you can actually eat at times that are not Passover and think, oh, this is actually good.
I bake a lot of bread, and I always try to be sensitive around not sharing pictures on Instagram during Passover, because it does feel unkind to put a loving picture of bread up.
That is thoughtful of you. Sarah, thank you so much for joining us today. Really appreciate this conversation.
Thank you, guys. This was great.
All right. Thanks, Sarah.
And thank you all for listening in today. We hope to have a new episode up soon, but until then, stay safe. Thank you. Thank you for listening to this episode of Power and Flour. This episode was produced by Eli Maskett. We encourage you to follow and rate this podcast wherever you listen to it. Watch for new episodes at the end of each week.